Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Chapter 25, Section 3, all about the spread of industrialization. We'll be talking about how, while yes, it began in Great Britain, it wasn't long before this trend of industrialization and mass production spread to other parts of the world. In fact, in the United States, maybe more so than other countries, we were able to industrialize quickly for several reasons. Number one, we are a very large country, ergo we have access to large amounts of natural resources. We are a heavily populated country with even in the early 1900s, a population of tens of millions growing into hundreds of millions. We also just had the resources to industrialize. We also had, again, land, labor, capital, and then entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs mean people wealthy enough to invest their own money into private industry. For example, Samuel Slater was an English textile worker, came to the United States, knew the industry well enough to build his own textile mills and developed the very first textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts. Towns began to spring up around these industries because so many people wanted to work in these jobs because they paid better. And so they would flock to these towns. Textiles, cloth making was the first industry to industrialize, but it wasn't long before clothing could be made en masse, and even shoes were being made.
The self-destructive conflict at Eastern was a familiar old story to American companies. It can be traced to the beginnings of the wage system and the first arrangements between workers and owners in America's early factories. Early in the 19th century, 3/4 of American property owners worked for themselves. These farmers and craftsmen owned their own businesses, so they had a personal and financial stake in their success. In 1813, Massachusetts merchant Francis Cabot Lowell built America's first factory, a 4-story cotton mill that organized all the tasks of carding, spinning, and weaving under one roof. The efficiency of Lowell's new power loom made obsolete the slower skills of many independent weavers and sewers. By 1823, a town bearing Lowell's name hosted a huge complex of textile mills. To staff its new plants, Lowell recruited women from farms all over New England. The mill owners lodged them in boarding houses known as the Palaces of the Poor, where they were strictly chaperoned by matrons of high character. The Lowell girls, as they were called, gave up the self-sufficiency of farm life for a weekly wage. They were soon joined in the mills by immigrants and the independent weavers and sewers whom the new factories had replaced.
As we look at expansion in the United States, during the American Civil War, this change was really becoming apparent. The North had industrialized. There were hundreds of miles of railroad tracks for every mile in the South. There were hundreds of miles of telegraph lines and even roads. There were larger cities, there were more factories, etc., etc. And so cities like Chicago were experiencing booms in population. And even smaller companies were beginning to merge into larger ones. Much of that industrial development was going on in the North.
During the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution attracted people from the farms to the city, where they could find work in manufacturing. Most of these jobs were in the North because 80% of the country's factories were located in its large industrial cities. These new workers dramatically increased the population of the North. Northerners controlled most of the railroads in the country. This made it easy for the North to trade goods and crops with the West and with the South. They also built canals to move food and resources into the cities and to ship their manufactured products to markets in other regions. The North was a place where wealth was greatly concentrated. The North controlled most of the banks. This meant that Southerners had to borrow money from Northerners. The Southern states were agricultural. Most of the people in the South were farmers. They raised cash crops for money. Their crops were sold in the northern states and to Europe. They sold crops like rice, tobacco, and sugarcane. However, it was cotton that made southern plantation owners wealthy. The majority of the world's raw cotton came from the South.
And so I want to give you an example of a smaller company merging into a larger one. So let's say that you start a business making clothes. Your first years are going to be rather tough. You're going to be making clothes. Well, you got to have money to make clothes. You're going to be buying fabric. You're going to be investing time and labor. Well, let's say after a few years, you're doing well. You've got a clothing line. You've got a brand. You've got distribution. You've got retail. People are buying your product. Well, the next step is to incorporate. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's a formal process where you become a corporation and you can begin to sell shares of your stock. You'll maintain the controlling share, but you're going to begin to encourage people to invest in your company. That's when you really begin to make the big bucks. And so these large corporations can grow and grow and eventually buy out new corporations. About 10 years ago, Google bought YouTube, for example. So their video line was failing compared to YouTube. So Google just bought them. It's the same for many other companies. Those mergers, when conglomerates become that powerful, they control large shares of certain industries. Now, we got to go back to politics for just a moment. The Napoleonic Wars were disrupting in Europe to the economy. All of Europe was at war. And so it definitely hurt them economically, Lots of debt from raising these huge armies, lots of devastation from the battles being fought on their home turf. And so the Industrial Revolution took a little longer to catch on in continental Europe as a result. But places like Belgium caught on quickly because they had a wealth of resources. They had access to water transportation. And so people began to start companies there by the late 700s. Germany also caught on. By the mid 1800s, there were railroads, there were lots of industries despite any political or economic barriers. And so industrialization was spreading throughout the world, particularly in Europe and the United States. However, even through to the early 1900s, many people were still farmers. And so that trend where most people are not farmers is a fairly recent one. Well, with industrialization, that means that more people are working for someone than working on a farm. And so with that, you get these entrepreneurs like Samuel Slater who are investing in starting a business so that they can make lots of money. But they're not sharing that money equally with their employees because their goal in that business is to make money for themselves. And so you get this income gap, a wealth gap. For example, industrialized countries are growing wealthy, non-industrial countries are growing further behind. So to industrialize, also that means you need lots and lots and lots of natural resources. We cut down almost all of our trees in the United States in the early 1900s as part of this trend, and then we started finding wood from elsewhere. We mined up much of our coal, we dug up much of our iron, and then we began to source those products elsewhere. Well, to get those products elsewhere, it's going to start American business interest overseas. It's going to entangle us in all types of weird and sketchy diplomatic and foreign policy concerns. Not only us, but all of the countries. And so industrialization actually contributed to the two global wars. And in general, this is going to transform our societies. For one, more people are going to have more money. And in fact, that's better for democracy because more people are going to live comfortably and are going to be able to enjoy the luxuries of living in a democratic country.
To picture England before the Industrial Revolution, we must imagine a nation that was the most powerful on earth and yet possessed no real factories. A country that had just one large city, London. For the most part, England was a quiet and lovely land of farms and rural villages where only the sounds of weather, of animals, and the distant ringing of church bells broke the stillness of the landscape. Yet England was a land of great social inequality. A handful of aristocrats owned most of the land and possessed by right of birth nearly all of the incredible wealth it yielded. They built magnificent palaces for themselves and filled them with treasure, while an enormous lower class, most of whom owned no land, struggled to survive, often paying rent to the wealthy landowners. These poor people sometimes faced severe malnutrition and even starvation. They usually died young. With this as a background, let us find out what great changes were to occur as a result of industrialization. The first Industrial Revolution began in England for several reasons. First, she possessed rich deposits of iron and coal, resources essential to industrialization. Second, England had many reliable sources of water power. And third, numerous colonies around the world supplied her with abundant raw materials, like this cotton. And at the same time, they provided an enormous captive market for her manufactured goods, like this cloth. These colonial markets helped to stimulate the British textile and iron industries, and in the beginning, it was the wealth produced by these two industries that drove the Industrial Revolution. During the mid-18th century, the growing demand for goods such as the iron hand tools seen here resulted in greater competition among manufacturers. And as costs of production rose, manufacturers sought new ways of meeting the increased demand for their products without raising prices.